Hi, I'm Tamara Kandaker. On Wednesday, in cities across Canada, protesters and counter-protesters rallied in response to a call from a group called 1 Million March for Children. According to the organizers' website, the day was supposed to be about advocating for the elimination of a number of things in schools: the sexual orientation and gender identity curriculum, pronouns, quote-unquote gender ideology, and mixed bathrooms.
My role is leading the people in a march to protect our children's innocence, to give family rights back, and to protect parental rights in school.
They don't have the maturity to decide to drink or to have guns or to vote. How the hell they have the right to change their sex without even the knowledge of their parents?
But critics, like the president of the BC Teachers Federation, say the group and its concern for parental rights is being driven by misinformation and disinformation.
There is no, influence on students to do anything other than to learn and to be themselves and to be comfortable with themselves and to be comfortable with everyone in their school around them. And to understand that there are differences in each of those people around them and how to live together and support each other to be happy and healthy.
The turnout looked different from city to city. In some places, counter-protesters outnumbered protesters, and there were some pretty heated exchanges between the two groups, with arrests reported in Ottawa, Halifax, Vancouver, and Victoria. Today, we're taking a closer look at the protests, who was behind them, and how the controversy over inclusive education policies and curricula is affecting LGBTQ students. My first guest is Mel Woods, a senior editor with Extra Magazine. They attended two separate protests in Vancouver on Wednesday. Hi, Mel. Thanks for joining us again.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So, can you start by describing the scene on Wednesday in Vancouver where you were? How many people showed up for what the organizers called the 1 Million March for Children?
Definitely not 1 million people, I'll tell you that. It was a fairly small contingent of the quote-unquote main protest there. I'd say maybe a couple dozen people tops at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and a bit of a few more people at a subsequent event down at Jack Pool Plaza. But they were outnumbered by counter-protests by metrics of hundreds to one, I would say. There was several thousand pro-trans counter-protesters who came out to the Vancouver Art Gallery. So definitely outnumbered in Vancouver by far.
Okay. And yeah, that sounds similar to what I heard about other cities, but we'll talk about that in a second. What did you see in Vancouver? What were people saying, and what kinds of chants did you hear? What kinds of signs did you see? Talk a bit about that.
This 1 Million March folks are really focused in on this idea of parental rights, this idea of, a lot of messaging of hands off our kids or leave our kids alone. At one point, they even broke into that song, hey, teacher, leave our kids alone.
Yeah.
Anti-grooming discourse. We see some, LGB without the T, which is a reference to kind of a movement that's moves to disclude trans people from bigger queer and trans issues. But then there was also kind of anti-gay messaging too. It's a lot of disparate groups. It's kind of like the convoy in a lot of ways, where they all kind of have these disparate causes coming together under this banner, but it's not really organized, and they're not necessarily unified in what they're saying or who they're associating with. So it was quite scattered, I would say, the messaging that they were putting forward. Whereas on the other side, the counter protesters, it was a lot of no space for hate, trans kids have rights, that sort of messaging over and over.
The organizers had said this wasn't about targeting LGBTQ plus people, but some of the things that you're mentioning, and I've seen other reporting on this about signs calling people in the community groomers and pedophiles. Can you talk a bit about that? Did you see, stuff that was about more than just what's being taught in schools?
Oh, 100%. It's a historic thing. It goes all the way back to, the 80s and 90s, talking about gay people, about this idea of like hypersexualizing queer and trans people, and this idea that queer and trans issues are not appropriate for kids to learn about, to talk about, whether that's being taught explicitly in schools or just being exposed to. And there's this largely based in misinformation and disinformation idea that like queer and trans people are somehow indoctrinating children and trying to like, recruit us to the cause simply through being able to give kids information that queer and trans people exist and are people with rights. And a lot of these groups are really opposed to that.
My kids don't go to school to learn this. They go to school to learn mathematics, languages. They don't go to school to learn about soji.
Well, when they get talked to, do you want to be a boy or a girl, or do you decide this and that? They shouldn't be deciding nothing at young ages. They should be having fun, learning ABCs, learning the proper English and maths and stuff like that. Sex education is up to the parents.
And so I definitely saw a lot of messaging around that. I definitely heard a lot of this messaging, but it's also, I think, really important with this to say that these things are based in a lot of disinformation, lies, suggesting that kids are undergoing genital surgery at the age of 4, or that we're trying to pump 10-year-olds full of hormones or things like that. These are like categorically untrue. And so much of this kind of these chants, these banners, these ideologies come from that misinformation.
Right. What can you tell me about how these protests played out in other cities across the country?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, like those places, we saw a huge contingent of counter protesters meet these much smaller contingents of protesters, varying degrees of the proportion there. But overall, the vibes were nice. Like, I will say, it was like, I had a bit of fear going in, as somebody who's quite visibly trans, you worry about your own personal safety going into these situations. You worry about how big one side will be versus the other. And it was very nice to show up to the plaza and have 5,000 people carrying trans flags and only a few people saying that I shouldn't exist. But that's not the case everywhere, though. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind with all this, that in places like Mississauga, in Surrey, out here in BC, the contingent of protesters to counter protesters was flipped in the skew. There's a lot more of the anti-trans protesters than there were the supportive counter protesters. And that led to some really escalating tensions.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important when we're like painting the narrative of what happened on Wednesday, that we keep in mind that it looked very different across the country. And that has to do with demographics. It has to do with where these kind of ideas and this misinformation I was talking about are getting footholds into communities and into school boards and into parents groups and things like that. So it's different from place to place.
This is a pretty big thing to pull off, though, like organizing protests in so many different places across the country. What do we know about the organizers behind this event?
It's really a disparate group of people. There's not one central group that's like, yes, we are the ones. It's kind of like the convoy in that sense. I think it's a really good comparison. I think that this group probably took a lot of cues from the convoy and how it played out, and are mobilizing under very similar tactics, because we see this kind of disparate group of anti-trans organizations, anti-queer organizations, parental rights groups, right-wing organizations. There are groups with ties back to the convoy, back to the anti-vax movement, all kind of promoting these marches and these events, and I'm participating in kind of the promotion and the dissemination of them. We have groups like that are based in the UK and the US that have a track record of fighting against, pro-trans legislation in those places, who are now trying to find a foothold in Canada. We have groups that have been advocating for school boards to get more conservative candidates into school boards to help pass policies that restrict some trans rights and that sort of thing. But they really vary across the spectrum. And you can see even just from like the posters promoting these events, it was kind of disorganized.
Interesting. And then what kind of reaction did we see from political leaders? I know some of them were at these protests and put out statements about them, right? Talk a bit about that.
So in Ottawa, you saw NDP leader Jagmeet Singh joined counter-protesters, marched on the front with carrying a banner.
No hate, no fear. Trans people are welcome.
Other politicians who came out kind of strongly in support of the counter protest included out here in BC, Premier David Eby wasn't at the Vancouver event, but several MLAs were, including Chilliwack Kent MLA Kelly Padden, who spoke at the counter protest and really kind of firmly affirmed the government's support of trans kids, trans rights, and opposition to this protest.
All of our kids, mine and yours, deserve to know in a crystal clear way where their government stands. We have been very clear, and Premier David Eby has been crystal clear in speaking with students and teachers. We stand for everyone.
A lot of other politicians kind of put out statements saying, we love LGBTQ2S+ folks. Trudeau did that. Other political leaders did that. But then on the other side of things, you have New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs, who, there's a picture going around of him shaking hands with the protester.
So you mentioned Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, but did we hear anything from Pierre Poilievre on this?
No, the Conservative leader was quiet, much as he has been about the anti-trans policy resolutions that were passed by the Conservative Party at their recent convention. The Canadian press did report that there was a memo sent out to Conservative MPs, basically telling them to do the same thing, to not talk about it to the media, to not post online about either the protests or the counter-protests. And I think things like this protest, things like the continued pushing forward by provincial premiers like Moe and like Higgs, shows that this is going to be an issue in the next federal election. This is going to be a hot button issue, and Poilievre is going to have to say something at some point to appease the right-wing base that is, pounding the drum on these issues right now, and also the queer trans folks and allies on the other side who are rightfully very concerned about the potential of Canada's next government endorsing these sorts of ideas. But as for right now, he is choosing the silent route.
Okay, Mel, thank you so much for your reporting on this and for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it. It was really good to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I really appreciate it.
Alex Harris is a 17-year-old student in Riverview, New Brunswick. He came out as trans about 5 years ago, before it was provincially mandated that parents give their consent for students to be able to use their chosen name or pronoun. Alex was watching as the protests unfolded across the country on Wednesday, and we wanted to get his take on the debate at the heart of them and hear about how it's impacting his life and that of his peers. Hi, Alex. Thanks for being with us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so seeing these marches take place across the country on Wednesday, what did that feel like for you?
It was really scary because it shows that many people are misinformed about what's happening in school and what it is to be trans and what it is to be a trans youth. And it's scary because these people are very loud. Sometimes they can be violent, and it's scary to see that in my own country as a trans youth.
Yeah. You were probably paying attention to the coverage of these protests, right? I'm wondering if you saw kind of the messages that were coming out of them, and was there anything that stuck out to you as particularly concerning?
Most of it is stuff that I've already seen in similar messaging coming out of the United States. One of the big ones that kind of got me was the idea that children belong to their parents. I'm not a parent. I'm still a child. I still live with my parents, but it was something that kind of got me because I don't belong to my parents. Yes, my parents are responsible for taking care of me, but I'm not their property.
I know you were invited to go to a counter protest in Moncton, but you decided not to, right? How come? What made you decide against that?
Yeah, so originally I was planning on going to the counter protest in Moncton, but I decided against it simply because of safety. It is dangerous to go to counter protests, and we weren't sure how violent the protest in Moncton was going to get. And when you are at a protest where there is a counter protest, or if you are counter protesting a protest, then you are clearly in two groups that are firmly against each other,
Hmm.
and that can cause violence really easily. And I also, like, I wanted to keep myself physically safe, but I also wanted to stay mentally safe. Being around that kind of messaging just isn't good for my mental health, because that's messaging that something is wrong with me, or that somehow I'm dangerous, or somehow the teachers who support me are dangerous, or my parents supporting me is dangerous. And I just didn't want to be exposed to that much of that messaging.
Yeah. So these protesters, they say that they're against what they call gender ideology in schools. So LGBTQ inclusive education policies that they say exclude parents, and the way that issues around sexuality and gender identity are taught in schools. And you're obviously someone who's at the center of this debate, and you did come out at school. So I wanted to ask you, what was that experience like for you?
It definitely wasn't what people who were at the protests was describing. I came out to my teachers, and I came out at school before I came out to my parents. The first step for me was I talked to my GSA, my Gender and Sexuality Alliance teacher at my school, and I said, "Hey, I'm trans. What's the safest and easiest way to go about this?" And then she helped me come out to my teachers, because I wasn't ready to talk to my parents yet.
Hmm.
And that was an easy process. And then soon after, I felt comfortable that even if my parents didn't react the way I hoped they would still have support somewhere. So I gained the confidence to talk to my parents, and it didn't go exactly as I'd hoped. It took them a few months to wrap their minds around the subject. But
Yeah.
even during that period of time where they hadn't quite wrapped their minds around things yet, I had support at school.
Wow.
And it really meant a lot to me. And it wasn't like nobody encouraged me not to tell my parents. I was encouraged to tell my parents. My GSA teacher at my school is incredible. And she guided me through the whole process. She taught me like safe strategies to use to start that conversation. She offered to be there as a mediator to have that conversation with my parents. And it was with her encouragement that I gained the confidence to talk to my parents in the first place.
Hmm. You're in New Brunswick, and you came out before the Conservative provincial government changed school policy so that teachers can't use a child's requested pronouns without parental consent. And we heard on Wednesday Premier Blaine Higgs tell protesters outside the legislature in Fredericton that inclusive policies were teaching students to lie to their parents.
What we found is that parents didn't know. Parents did not know that in the education system, children are being taught to lie to their parents. They didn't know that, and now they know. So it's a pretty sad situation, really.
But
Yes, we have a
you're
plan.
saying that that was never the case.
Yeah, I was encouraged to tell my parents. And I know some students who can't tell their parents because it would be unsafe in their household if they were out as transgender, or if they were out as any LGBTQ identity. But yeah, there was no point where I was ever encouraged to lie to my parents. I was told, if you're going to get kicked out, it's best not to mention it. But once I said, yeah, that's not a risk,
Hmm.
and I'm not at risk of abuse, then it was, yeah, you got to tell your parents, Alex, eventually, once you're comfortable.
Yeah.
And being given that space to come out to a community that I knew had to be supportive because of the policy that was in place before coming out to my parents gave me a lot more confidence. I didn't feel forced or rushed throughout my coming out process, because it's a difficult and it's a really personal process to come out.
So this is the first school year with this new policy in New Brunswick. Saskatchewan has introduced a similar plan. Have you heard much from other trans students about how these new rules are affecting them?
It's already affecting students. One of my friends had to had to ask me, is this teacher safe to come out to, before coming out to our GSA teacher. It took me a minute to remember why they asked me that, because I was like, well, of course that teacher's safe. And then I went, oh yeah, teachers don't have to gain students' consent before talking to their parents.
Yeah.
And for that student, they would have been at risk of physical abuse if their parents were to find out they're trans.
Beyond that, I'm wondering, have you noticed a difference at school in how you're treated since this change in policy came into effect?
I'm lucky enough that I don't have any teachers at my school that I'm seriously worried about disrespecting me. And because I'm 17 and I'm out and I'm out to my parents, the policy still protects me and it still protects my rights. I have noticed that students have been, like, bullying towards me has increased. The slurs that are yelled in the hallway has increased tenfold. And a lot of that has increased. And I think it's because that the government has said it's okay to be disrespectful to LGBTQ people.
Just going back to the protests then, some of the 1 Million March organizers have said that these demonstrations weren't about fighting the LGBTQ community, but about, quote, the indoctrination of children in public schools and protecting children against LGBTQ ideology in the school system. And I'm wondering what you would say to that. What effect do you think these protests have on the LGBTQ community?
I think that the people that organized the protests and most of the people that showed up at the protests aren't anti-LGBTQ as a whole. What is there is a misunderstanding of what being LGBTQ and what being trans is. And there's a misunderstanding about how it's being taught in schools. And it's a lot of the rhetoric that is coming to Canada from the States. And it's the misinformation that's really that's causing this.
So the day of cross-country protests is over, but these conversations are still happening, obviously. How does what you're seeing unfold within Canadian governments and in communities make you feel about the future?
I'm scared. I'm scared for my rights, and I'm scared for the students coming after me, because I only have a year, maybe even less, left of school, and I don't know what's going to happen when I'm not here to advocate for other students at my school. And there are people who are advocating for everyone at every school across the country, but it's going to keep getting worse before it gets better. And I'm really scared, because even, like, there's the conversation about how gender identity and sexuality is taught in school. And then there's other controversies about transgender people that are being brought into this country, as shown by the Conservatives adopting 2 points to do with transgender rights. And these are rights that when I first came out, I never thought would be under attack. And now my rights are under attack, and it's really scary.
Yeah. If you could speak to the protesters who turned out on Wednesday, what would you like them to understand?
I'd probably remind them I'm here and I'm human, and I'm not trying to do anything other than exist. Like every other kid, I want to go to college, and I have hobbies. I write, I do photography, and I have friends, and I walk to school every day like any other kid. Trans kids and transgender people are not a theoretical concept. We're real people. And when this kind of rhetoric is shouted out into the world like this, it's hurting real people.
Okay, Alex, thank you so much for your thoughts and your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's all for now. This week, Front Burner was produced by Dennis Kalnin, Shannon Higgins, Rafferty Baker, Joyita Shengupta, Lauren Donnelly, and Derek Vanderwyk. Our sound design was by Mackenzie Cameron and Sam McNulty. Our music is by Joseph Shabison. Our senior producer is Elaine Chow. Our executive producer is Nick McKay-Blokos. And the show was hosted this week by Jamie Poisson and me, Tamara Kandaker. Thanks so much for listening. Front Burner will be back on Monday.
The final seconds will tick away, and Canada, for the first time ever, the senior men's national team has won a medal at the World Cup.
Hi, I'm Tamara Kandaker.
To get everyone to this level and then to deliver against Team USA in such a dramatic fashion, it really is just a special, special moment for the sport in this country. You're not going to forget this ever.
Germany may have won gold this weekend, their first FIBA Men's Basketball World Cup ever, but it was Canada's overtime upset against the United States in the bronze medal playoff game that has fans and sports writers breathlessly arguing that Canadian men's basketball has finally hit the world stage. Today, we're going to be talking about why placing third was such a big deal and explaining the long road that Canada's men's team took to get here. Oren Weisfeld is a freelance sports journalist in Toronto. He joins me now. Hi, Oren. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Tamara. Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot being written about this tournament, and the overall feeling, other than celebration, obviously, is this tangible realization of potential. Why does this win feel like such a turning point, and why is this so exciting?
It's exciting because this is really the first time that the Canadian men's team has had any level of success at the international level in 23 years.
Mhm.
Bronze might not sound like a huge deal to some people, but you have to remember that this is the most difficult competition in international basketball. The Olympics might get more shine, but the World Cup is a 32 team competition compared to 12 at the Olympics.
Mm.
And then the World Cup also acts as a qualifier for the Olympics next summer. So it's a big deal because Canada achieved a lot of firsts in this competition. You know, they won bronze for the first time ever at a World Cup, their first medal ever at a World Cup. They beat the USA for the first time ever at a World Cup. And then they also qualified for the Olympics for the first time since 2000. So it's just a big deal because A, they achieved all those firsts, and B, this is really the first time that this group has ever played together. So it's just really exciting looking forward. It's a young group and they seem to be committed for the long haul.
Mhm.
So when you look forward of the future of Canadian basketball, it's just a really exciting time right now.
And it's worth mentioning that Canada's women's team has already had a fair bit of success, right? And this is like the first time Canada's men's basketball is actually hitting the world stage.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the men are catching up to the women in a lot of ways. The women have won bronze twice at World Cups, and they placed fourth last summer at the World Cup.
Opportunity for Canada. Che, no good. And they're going to let it wind down as Australia now are all smiles. They have won bronze here at this year's FIBA Women's Basketball.
But for the men, this has been a struggle for a very long time. You know, for the people who have been paying very close attention, you could see this coming for sure. There is more and more NBA players coming from Canada over the last few years. You know, over just the last 2 years, Jamal Murray and Andrew Wiggins, two Canadians, were both the second best players on championship teams in Golden State.
Bringing the trophy back to the hometown, my hometown, is amazing. You know, it's something that hasn't been done before. It's like a dream come true. You know, I'm bringing the trophy back to where it all started. You know, Vaughan City, where
and in Denver.
Jamal, just 2 years ago this time, you were barely able to walk, but you vowed to come back.
So It's been a long time coming, but for most Canadians, for most, casual basketball fans who only pay attention to these international competitions once every year, once every couple of years, this is the first time that this team has really been able to showcase themselves on that international stage.
Yeah. Okay. So if you were following this closely, you may have expected this, but what were Canada's odds going into the bronze medal game against the US?
Yeah, so I looked this up, and if we're talking about betting wise, they were 7.5 underdogs to the US, which means that America was expected to win by 7 or 8 points, depending on how you wanted to bet it. Looking back, the US was favored to win this whole World Cup going into it by pretty heavily. They were the only team with 12 NBA players. Canada had seven, for example. And, America is just a powerhouse in basketball. They've won the last four Olympic Games. I think they always kind of win at least when they send their best players, and
Mhm.
they had a ton of talent on their team, so people were expecting America to kind of run roughshod over it. Obviously, that didn't happen, and Canada throughout the whole tournament kind of proved to be a stronger team, beating, Spain, who's the number 1 team in the world, beating Slovenia, the number 7 team in the world, beating France, who's the number 5 team in the world, whereas the United States, again, heading into this game, they lost 2 games against good competition. So America was the favorite, but at the same time, you could kind of see that Canada was a stronger team coming into it.
Yeah, I saw the US's head coach, Steve Kerr. He said after losing to Germany in the semifinal that
This is not 1992 anymore. And so players are better all over the world, teams are better.
which is a reference to the legendary men's USA Olympic Dream Team.
11 Hall of Famers, the most magnificent assemblage of athletic talent ever gathered together on one roster in any sport at any time.
What's been the reaction in the US to the American team's performance in this tournament?
Yeah, there's been a lot of hand wringing about whether or not they should consider this a disappointment because, on one hand, they didn't send their A team and they did kind of achieve a goal, which was to qualify for next summer's Olympics, which is when they probably will send a lot of their best talent.
Mhm.
But at the same time, they finished fourth. So there's kind of been a lot of questions right now about whether or not the recipe and the formula that USA basketball is following is a good one. Because instead of holding tryouts like Team Canada does, instead of asking for a 3-year commitment, which is what Team Canada did last summer, asking their NBA players to commit for 3 summers in a row in the lead up to the 2024 games, USA basketball just kind of asked 12 different NBA players if they would play.
Mm.
And it obviously didn't work out for them. So there's a lot of questions about whether or not that strategy is the right one because in the past USA basketball could get by on talent alone, and now they're learning that the rest of the world has caught up to them in a lot of regards.
Right. So, unlike Canada, the US is like throwing together a new team every summer and expecting them to compete against the best in the world.
Exactly.
So, all of this happened without two of Canada's best players, Andrew Wiggins and Jamal Murray. Both of them sat out this tournament. So, let's take a minute to talk about the athletes who dominated the court for Canada, starting with Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. What should we know about him?
Yeah, so Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, he's 25-year-old point guard.
Gilgis Alexander, Canada leads.
He played college basketball in Kentucky and then was drafted by the Los Angeles Clippers. It's funny for, Toronto Raptors fans because Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, who I'll call SGA from now on,
Okay.
he was actually a big part of the reason that Kawhi Leonard was able to leave the Raptors in 2019 and go to the Los Angeles Clippers because Kawhi wanted to team up with his friend Paul George. And to do that, the Clippers had to trade this young point guard named SGA to Oklahoma City Thunder to get Paul George. But at the time, nobody knew how good Shea would be. And he had some upside. He was a lottery pick, but at the same time, he didn't come into the league like blowing the socks off anyone. But slowly every year he's gotten better and better. He was a top 5 MVP candidate, which is the first time a Canadian has done that since Steve Nash won it in 2006. And After this tournament, after what he did for Canada at the World Cup, he's now very clearly the best Canadian in the world. So definitely someone that Canadians should be paying attention to going forward because we've really never had a talent like this.
Shea gets it, spins away, baseline shot. Shea puts it in. Unable to put home the putback, and then it's Gilgeous-Alexander dropping a hammer. Wants the step back three on the way, and Shea knocks it down for the lead.
Yeah. For people who don't follow basketball, I guess the big thing to take away from this is that he's like a legitimate superstar in the NBA.
He is. I mean, to be 25 years old and to be basically named the fifth best player in the world is a huge accomplishment, and he will be in the conversation for MVP for the next few years.
Another player who made a big impact was Dylan Brooks, who's a bit of a character. What is he known for, and what role did he play in this tournament?
Yeah, I mean, that's an understatement. He's a big character.
Yeah.
He he's basically known for just being this energy guy, this guy who trash talks.
Hey, that's technique. That's technique. It's a big boy. Good.
He said it himself that when he gets onto the court, he has a completely different persona than the person he is off of it. And to be honest, that's because he had to find a niche to survive in the NBA. Unlike Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, Dylan Brooks was not a highly touted prospect. He was the 45th pick out of 60 picks in the draft. And to survive in the NBA, had to kind of find a role. And for him, that was like this rugged defender who kind of stirred things up with his opponents. And he's had a successful 6 seasons in Memphis, but at the end of last season, it kind of backfired on him. He called LeBron James, who is, for many years was the best player in the world.
I don't care. He's old. You know what I mean? I was waiting for that. I was expecting him to do that game 4, game 5. He wanted to say something when I got my 4th foul. He should have been saying that earlier on. But, I poke bears. I don't respect
in the middle of their playoff series between the Grizzlies and the Lakers, and then he backed it up by really playing poorly himself. So Brooks was the brunt of a lot of jokes this offseason because Memphis basically blamed their problems on him. They said they weren't going to bring him back under any circumstances. And people took jabs on him on social media. They joked about whether or not he would even be back in the NBA after the way he flamed out last season. And then, after a few days of free agency, he got paid $86 million by the Houston Rockets. So he surprised a lot of people with that contract. A lot of people criticized it, but he proved it in this tournament that he really could play selflessly. He could play a small role and really thrive in it. He shot the ball well. He was named the defender of the tournament. So he really kind of rewrote the script on his career in this tournament.
Was at stake? Was it the best game of your career? Yeah, I feel like it. Coming off a tough year with my whole squad, it was great. Having a refresh with Canadian blood. Guys.
Okay, so that's a bit about what happened during the tournament and who the big players were. But I think to fully appreciate how well Canada is doing right now, it's probably worth going back to where we started. How has Canada's men's basketball program been criticized in the past?
Yeah, so let's go back to 2000. That was the last time that the Canadian men's team has really had any success. And that's when they were in the Olympics, led by a young Steve Nash, and they beat the former Yugoslavia in the Olympics. They ended up placing 7th. And at the time, that was a massive accomplishment. They only had 2 NBA players on that team, Nash and Todd McCullough. The rest of their players were basically European pros who weren't quite good enough to make it to the NBA. Since then, there's just been a ton of turnover at the coaching ranks, at the players' ranks. They didn't have enough funding. They didn't have enough resources to, whether it was fly their players private, whether it was set up exhibition games, whether it was even kind of having the best training facilities for these players to practice on in the summers. So it was a couple decades basically of failure at the international level and also NBA players not wanting to represent their country. And it's hard to hold it against those players because Canadians have never, until now, cared about international basketball, to be frank. This isn't hockey. There has never been
Mm.
a real culture of basketball even in this country until the last 5 or 10 years. And so those players looked at it. They looked at the fact that Team USA was probably going to walk over them if they did play, and they just didn't see enough upside in playing.
So, what's changed since then? What has the program done to turn things around?
A lot has definitely changed. It starts with getting Canadians and Canadian men to kind of be inspired and to see role models make it to the highest level. For one generation, that definitely happened with the 2019 Raptors championship team.
And that's it. There's a new NBA champion, and it's a team from Toronto, Canada. We, the North, are now we, the champions, the Raptors. The 2019
Zach Edey, who is the lone college player on this version of Team Canada, told me that that's when he kind of thought that, okay, Canadians can actually do it at the highest level of basketball. But again, he's young. Like before that, it was a generation of guys like Steve Nash and then Tristan Thompson, Corey Joseph, Andrew Wiggins. Those guys all came into the NBA in the 2010s. And I think it's the cumulative effect of having all these role models coming out of all these different parts of Canada, not just Toronto, and having Canadians have players who they can look up to who made it out of their neighborhood, made it to the NBA, and kind of proved that, that's possible for them too.
Right.
So that's definitely the first part of it. And the second is the how. It's like once you are inspired, you still need the infrastructure in place to compete and to train and to give yourself the very best chance you could to make the NBA. And so this is where a lot of those Canadian stars of the past that I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
those guys who played in Europe and who weren't good enough to make it to the NBA, that's when they came back to Canada in the 2000s and the 2010s, and they started to help the next generation as coaches, as executives, as trainers, kind of putting their time and resources into the next generation. And Rowan Barrett is a really good example of this.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Rowan Barrett. So he's a former Canadian basketball player, but what else should people know about him?
Rowan Barrett is the father of RJ Barrett, who is New York Knicks star, who was on this Canadian team.
The kick. Barrett for three. RJ Barrett. And Canada leads by 9.
And he's also the general manager of the Canadian men's program. So he got into basketball in his late teenage years, and he tried to make it to the NBA. But at the time, again, Canada didn't really have those resources to help him out. So it was a bit too late for him, too little, too late. And he instead kind of had this professional career in Europe. And he also played for Team Canada. And then Rowan had RJ in 2000, and then he came back to Canada and he started working with Canada Basketball as the assistant GM to Steve Nash at the time. And Rowan really prioritized kind of building out the youth programs, doing training camps, identifying players from a younger age and training them, and putting more resources into the youth teams. And then RJ, just in comparison to Barrett, he had every resource in the world to kind of maximize his talents from a very young age.
Mhm.
He had every advantage that the previous generation didn't have because of guys like Rowan coming back to Canada and investing in the next generation in the way that they did.
Okay, so eventually this grassroots investment started to pay off, and Canada started producing a lot of homegrown, world class talent, and that's reflected in the NBA, right? How represented has Canada been in the NBA in the last 5-10 years?
Canada's had the most NBA players of any country outside of the United States for what will now be 10 seasons when this season kicks off in October. They had a record 22 players in the league last season. And they also have like a few legitimate stars when it's Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, Andrew Wiggins, Jamal Murray. These guys are three of the best 40, 50 players in the world coming from Canada. And it's also at the point where now every NBA draft, we're seeing 2 to 3 Canadians get drafted. In the last 2 years alone, we've had Shaedon Sharpe, Benedict Mathurin, Andrew Nembhard, Omax Prosper, Leonard Miller, all drafted in the last 2 drafts. So it is an exciting time for sure because that talent is there. This year, it's going to be more than 22 players in the NBA. And again, when you look at college, when you look at the guys coming up from the NCAA ranks to the NBA, and this is also true on the women's side from the NCAA to the WNBA,
Hmm.
we're seeing a ton of young talent that's going to be there for years to come.
Right. If you're a star player, why would you think twice about wanting to play in this tournament?
Yeah, it's a really good question that I don't think a lot of people understand. It's easy to criticize guys for not representing their country from afar, but it's a lot more complicated than that. For most NBA players, they will not spend their summers playing for the national team unless they have a long-term contract in place because there's just too much money to lose, right? There's been a lot of examples of NBA players getting injured in these international competitions. And if that happens and you don't have a contract in place, you risk losing a lot of potential money from your NBA team. So that's also part of the reason to go back why we haven't had commitment in the past few years is because so many of these players are young. And until they kind of got their second contract in the league, they didn't have that security of playing.
They had to fight hard. They had to make comebacks game after game. An incredible couple of weeks for this program as a whole. And boy, is there going to be a lot of excitement and a lot of momentum now for this program heading into the Olympics in Paris.
So, Oren, looking ahead, how do you think the men's team is stacking up to competition like Germany and Serbia and the U.S., obviously, for the Paris 2024 Summer Olympics?
Yeah, so Paris is going to be very tough for Canada. Obviously, Serbia is the team that knocked them out of this World Cup, and they were missing the best player in the world, Nikola Jokic, who will probably be there in Paris. And then also looking at the USA, they have players like Steph Curry and LeBron James, who are probably all going to be in Paris for kind of one last hurrah. So it's going to be tough for Canada. But when you look forward to Los Angeles 2028, for example, Canada has a real chance to win gold in that competition and moving forward because they have such a young group
Hmm.
and a group that seems to be together for the long haul, whereas some of these other countries are getting a bit older. So going forward, Canada has a lot of optimism.
Okay, cool. Super interesting. Oren, thank you so much. It was really nice talking to you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, that's all for today. I'm Tamara Kendacker. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Hi, I'm Tamara Kendacker.
Quote, do we have a clear plan on what we want Apple to do to undermine the Sun, close quote. Did you send this email, Mr. Gates, on or about August 8th, 1997?
I don't remember sending it.
25 years ago, Bill Gates took the stand in one of the biggest monopoly cases in U.S. history. The antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft, filed by the Department of Justice, argued the software company illegally created a monopoly for its web browser, Internet Explorer. The judge sided with the government, ruling the company would have to split in two. But Gates maintained that Microsoft did nothing wrong, and that tech is a beast of its own, different from other industries.
Despite this ruling, we believe the courts will ultimately find that all of Microsoft's actions have been completely legal and good for consumers. We don't think this decision matches the reality of the high technology industry, the intense competition, the rapid innovation, and lots of consumer benefits.
The ruling was partially overturned, and later there was a settlement. But the case helped open up the market and paved the way for the rise of some of today's tech giants, like Apple and Google. Now, Google is the target of a lawsuit of its own, one that could be even bigger than Microsoft's. The trial starts today and is scheduled to last 10 weeks. And at the heart of the issue is whether Google has achieved its search engine dominance fair and square, or whether it stacked the deck to block any potential competitors. Leah Nyland is an antitrust and investigations reporter with Bloomberg News. She's here with me to talk about what the U.S. government is alleging, how Google is responding, and what this case could mean for the future of the internet and the tools we've come to depend on for, well, almost everything. Hi, Leah. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by setting the stakes a bit. This has been called the federal government's first monopoly trial of the modern internet era, the antitrust case of the century. Just how big of a deal is this case?
It's a pretty big deal. Google has been under antitrust scrutiny now for more than a decade. It has paid more than $10 billion in fines in Europe. But this is the first case that could lead to a breakup of the company. And so the company is taking it very seriously. It has a lot of its, top executives and people in town to watch the trial, and its own CEO is probably going to take the stand later in the case.
Right. Okay. And I want to talk about some of the drama that we can expect to see during the trial. But before we get to that, just how big is Google in 2023?
Yeah, so Google, as everyone probably knows, is the most commonly used search engine. The Justice Department says it controls about 90% of the market for online search, and a very similar size for search advertising. These are like the text ads that you see at the top of a search page, but also all of those like images and videos you see all across the web. The company also, owns the largest video sharing platform with YouTube. It owns the most widely used mapping service with Google Maps. It owns tons of products that people use every day, like Gmail, Google Docs, and Android, which is the smartphone operating system on all Android phones.
Right. So this trial, I understand, is the culmination of separate complaints by the Justice Department and dozens of states. They've all been consolidated into a single case. And what is Google being accused of here?
Yeah, so there are two cases, but they're both pretty similar. So the government alleges that Google has sought to maintain its monopoly over search by entering into contracts with lots of different people: Apple, various people who make browsers like Mozilla, and also the people who sell or make phones like Samsung, like Verizon, like AT&T. And what happens with those contracts is they agreed to make Google the default search engine, meaning the one that you automatically use whenever you open up a browser or your phone. And in exchange, Google is giving them a cut of the advertising dollars that it makes from those searches. The Justice Department alleges that that means that Google has sort of locked up all of the entryways that a rival could use to grow as large as Google does, so that people like Microsoft's Bing and DuckDuckGo haven't been able to achieve the scale, in part because they can't get the data because Google is blocking the way.
So Google is essentially being accused of engaging in practices to maintain their monopoly. What do you expect the government's main arguments are going to be?
Yeah, so the government is planning to argue that Google has, has a monopoly that is almost not up for debate. As I mentioned, it has more than 90% of the market for online search. But they're arguing that it has taken actions in order to maintain that monopoly, which is against the law. And so they're going to point to a lot of these contracts. They're going to have the people who entered into these contracts come and testify about why they did it, the sort of money that Google has been paying to sort of maintain its status as the dominant search engine. There's probably going to be some really interesting evidence with Apple. As I mentioned before, Google and Apple have this agreement that makes Google the dominant search engine because it is the default in Safari. Now, when this agreement was entered into in 2005, practically no one used Safari. It was only available on Macs, and not that many people use Macs. But over the past 18 years, a lot more people use Safari now because it's the default on the iPad, it's the default on the iPhone, and a lot more people just use Macs in general. So because of that relationship, Google is now the default on so many places, and most people don't even know how to change that. So even if you had wanted to use a different search engine, most people don't know how to go through the phone to change that.
Okay, so the government is going to take the position that among other things, Google's agreements gave it an unfair advantage and allowed it to protect its monopoly. And what is Google likely to say in its defense?
Yeah, so Google argues that people use its products because they like to. They don't have to. They have this sort of catchphrase that they love to trot out, which is competition is just a click away. If you don't want to use Google, you can go up to the top of a search bar and go to Bing or go to DuckDuckGo and search from there. The other thing they argue is they're making a lot of money from the search advertising. And so they're sharing it with all of these people, with Apple, with the smartphone manufacturers. And in turn, that helps make products cheaper because they're getting money from somewhere else. So they don't have to charge the consumers who are buying the end product, like the phone.
Right. So in terms of precedent, judges have generally ruled against companies in antitrust cases only when they're hurting consumers. And that, from what I understand, usually has to do with companies being able to charge whatever they want because they have a monopoly. But in Google's case, their product is free. So what's the government's legal team going to have to show to win this case?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's part of the reason why this case hasn't been brought before now, because under the law, a lot of the time, the way that they would show harm is showing that the prices would increase, but Google's product is free. So what the government is going to argue is that you may not have been paying with your money, but you've been paying with your data. So Google sort of scrapes up a lot of information about you when you're using its search engine, like where you are and the sort of things that you're looking at. And that helps it sell more advertising. That's why it's the fourth largest company in the world. And so the government plans to argue that Google's monopoly has degraded the privacy options for people online and that it has also impacted innovation. One of the really interesting things they said a little bit earlier in the case is, we now have these really interesting things like ChatGPT and chatbots that can answer questions that you type in. Maybe if Google had kept improving its product instead of sort of resting on the laurels of its great search engine, we might have seen innovations like ChatGPT and those forms of search several years ago instead of just emerging now.
So am I right to say that for the government, this isn't necessarily a slam dunk case?
No, I mean, antitrust cases in and of themselves are pretty hard. The law is old. It was created in the 1800s, and over time, courts have made it more and more difficult to win, which is why, these cases are pretty rare.
Mm-hmm. So we mentioned the Microsoft antitrust case in the introduction, and I wonder if you see any ripple effects or impacts from that case now, 25 years later.
Yeah, a lot of people compare this to the Microsoft case from 25 years ago. In the Microsoft case, the company was accused of pre-installing its browser, Internet Explorer, on computers.
And it was a massive success. In just over a year, Microsoft gained 10% market share. This, of course, sent other companies' revenues plummeting.
And then creating technical barriers so that other people, like consumers or other computer makers, couldn't really install its rival, which was Netscape Navigator, on the computer.
The Netscape Navigator, software which makes it easy for people to connect to the global computer network called the Internet.
And Google says that this case is different. It does have some barriers to the other companies in the form of these contracts, but they're not technical barriers. You can still click and go to the other one. Another thing about the Microsoft case that people say is really interesting. If you think about it, 25 years ago this month is when Google started as a company. And 25 years ago next month is when the Microsoft case started in federal court. And a lot of people sort of tie those two events together. The fact that the government was investigating Microsoft and then brought this trial sort of opened the door to lots of new innovations in the form of Google and Amazon and all of these other great things that we have on the internet today. There have been previous cases that the Justice Department brought against monopolies, for example, the AT&T monopoly back in the day that led to the breakup of Ma Bell. And when that happened is when we started getting more interesting things in cellular technology, like the introduction of voicemail and the introduction of cell phones. So there's a lot of people who believe that maybe, with this case, the government is really trying to open up the technological innovation for the next generation of the internet.
This case is just getting underway, but there's already been quite a bit of maneuvering on both sides. The Justice Department's head of antitrust, Jonathan Cantor, has been recused from the case after Google accused him of bias because of his previous work for Microsoft. On the other side, the government has accused Google of destroying employees' instant messages. What was that all about?
Yeah, so Jonathan Cantor, who is the head of antitrust for the Justice Department, was a longtime Google critic. He represented a lot of companies that have complained about Google over the years, namely Microsoft, Yelp, and News Corp, which is the parent company of the Wall Street Journal. So Google argued when he was appointed that he had a bias against the company and shouldn't be allowed to sort of oversee the case. And so the Justice Department took him off for a while, and the case has been being overseen by his deputies. Google, however, on the other side, the Justice Department alleges that Google has been destroying chats. So if you use Gmail, you may be familiar with this, but inside the company, they have their own GChat system. And so they often instructed employees that if they were having sensitive conversations, they should do it over this chat. And these chats would be automatically deleted after 24 hours. So the Justice Department alleges that, if Google hadn't been deleting all these chats, we might have more evidence of the anti-competitive conduct that they're alleging in this case.
What does Google say in response to that, or how do they explain why they allowed these messages to be deleted?
They had instructed people to turn the archiving system on. So if they were doing anything that related to this case, they would have an archive of those chats. They don't necessarily dispute that some of them may have been deleted. They just say that it doesn't matter all that much. But the judge has agreed to allow evidence of this into the trial, and there is going to be some discussion about this and what sorts of chats may have existed and no longer do because they were deleted.
Based on what's already happened before the trial, it seems like the trial itself could also end up being pretty dramatic. There have already been 150 people deposed, and I understand some big name executives from other tech companies are expected to be called in as witnesses. 3 Apple executives tried and failed to get out of testifying. Whose testimony are you looking forward to hearing?
Yeah, so the Apple executive who I'm most looking forward to hearing from is Eddie Q. He is Apple's deal maker. He is a person who is in charge of making contracts with other companies. So back when Apple was creating the iPad, he created all of the contracts between Apple's and the publishers. And back then, the Justice Department sued, alleging that he was actually engaging in price fixing. So this is sort of going to be a second time that he's on stage defending the integrity of his contracts. Sundar Pichai, the Google CEO, is expected to testify, and that will be interesting because he's a longtime person at Google, and he has been involved in a lot of the decisions over time about how Google monetizes things. And then there should be some interesting people from a couple of the other companies. DuckDuckGo's executive Gabe Weinberg is expected to testify, and the executives from another search engine that was created by some Google alums, and it went out of business earlier this year because they just found that they couldn't keep making a consumer-facing search engine work when it was subscription.
Okay. So, what would happen if the judge ruled against Google and found that it broke the law?
Yeah, so this part of the trial is just focused on Google's alleged liability, so whether or not it broke the law. If the judge finds that Google did break the law, there's going to be an entire second proceeding on the remedy. So, how to resolve the fact that Google has harmed competition. So, that proceeding, the Justice Department hasn't yet said what it plans to ask for, but there are a couple possibilities floating out there. One is that it could ask for a breakup. So that would mean they would force Google to sell off certain parts of its business. So they could ask that it be forced to sell, for example, Chrome, the browser. They could ask for them to be required to sell off Android, the smartphone operating system. Or they could seek some kind of other type of remedy similar to what happened in the Microsoft case. So in the Microsoft case, there was oversight of the company for the next 10 years, and they were required to make certain changes to their system to ensure that other companies could essentially make products for PCs that worked with Windows. So one possibility that people have mentioned is sort of requiring Google to share some of the data that it has gotten from having this position on as the default in so many places. The Justice Department had a filing on Friday that said that Google gets 16 times the amount of data every day that Bing does, just because it's so much larger. And the fact that it has all of that data is what has allowed it to improve its product and be really good. If it was forced to share some of the underlying data, other search engines could really improve their results and become greater competitors.
Yeah, maybe talk a little bit more about that. What could these proceedings mean for other tech companies?
Yeah, there are very obvious things that it can mean for Google's immediate competitors like Microsoft Bing or DuckDuckGo or some of the newer search engines that have entered just in the past couple of years. There's one called like you.com. If Google was forced to share the data there, they could really like grow and expand, and there could suddenly be a lot more places for you to search online. Like maybe if you're looking for specific information like historical research or something, you would go to one search engine. Whereas if you're looking for fashion or modern things, you'd go to a different. Like we might all of a sudden have lots of different opportunities for search. The other thing that it could impact is, Google pays billions of dollars to a lot of these companies for its default position. No one knows exactly how much Google pays Apple, but there are estimates that it could be as much as $20 billion a year. So if Google is no longer allowed to pay Apple that $20 billion, that could significantly impact Apple's bottom line.
So, here in Canada, the government has introduced legislation that requires tech giants to pay news organizations for their news content. And in response, Meta has already started blocking news for Canadian users, and Google has said that it's going to do the same thing, although they haven't started doing that yet. And this is just one example of where we're seeing tech giants really flex their power. How could breaking up Google avert that kind of thing?
So the Justice Department and some other people who are supporters of this case argue that the only reason that companies like Meta and Google are able to do that is because they are so dominant. They have so much power that a decision by them really impacts like millions or billions of people. And so if we were to create more competition in these areas, if there were multiple search engines, if there were multiple social networks, even if one of them decided that they were going to cut off news, you could just go to the others and get the same thing. So that's sort of the underlying idea behind a lot of these antitrust cases against the tech giants is we need to introduce much more competition into these markets so that if one of them makes a decision that you don't like, you have the option to go somewhere else.
Right. And what are some of the big criticisms of big tech that you think wouldn't be addressed by Google losing this antitrust case?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of criticism about content moderation by Google. What links you see, what videos they take down on YouTube, that sort of thing. This case probably isn't going to have very much impact on that. YouTube is probably actually not going to come up that much because this mostly focuses on search and advertising, though YouTube ads may come up a little bit. So that's more of the idea that, if there are more options, they won't have as much control. But the actual underlying stuff about content moderation probably won't come up very much here.
And is this case the only avenue right now for taming big tech's power, or are there other trials coming up that you're watching?
So this is one of 5 cases that are pending against Google that have been brought by either the state attorneys general or the Justice Department. There's another pending case against Facebook that seeks to break it up and force it to sell off WhatsApp and Instagram. And the antitrust agencies here in the US also have pending investigations into Amazon.com and Apple. So this is just one of a number of cases that are pending, and the outcome could have an impact on some of those ones in the pipeline.
All right, Leah, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's all for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Hi, I'm Tamara Kandaker. So right now, if you're a student under the age of 16 in both New Brunswick and in Saskatchewan, and you want to use a different name from your given name or a different pronoun in the classroom, you have to get your parents' permission, as per policies introduced in the last couple of months by their provincial governments. There's been a lot of concern around these policies about the kind of harm they could cause to trans and non-binary youth.
We're making the government aware that this is not acceptable, that they are putting children's lives at risk.
By outing them to people that they're not ready to come out to is not the right thing to do for our kids and youth.
School should be a safe place where you can trust the people around you and be yourself. And sometimes home isn't that.
I know one of my friends would most likely get kicked out of their house, and another one could be at risk of physical abuse. Like, that's the reality of the situation.
But in defending these policies, the premiers of both provinces have been emphasizing the needs of another group. This is Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe.
This policy, by its very design, is designed to include parents in their child's education, to include parents in their child's school. What can be, more supportive than bringing parents closer to what is happening in their schools?
Asked about who was consulted on the policy changes, Moe said on social media that he believed, quote, the leading experts in children's upbringing are their parents. New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs has also talked a lot about the needs and rights of parents.
What we're hearing certainly are parents learning more about the policy and wanting to know more and wanting to play a role in their children's education, and wondering how there could be a policy that would actually hide information from them.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has echoed this rhetoric.
Look, this is a provincial policy. The Prime Minister has no business in decisions that should rest with provinces and parents. So my message to Justin Trudeau is butt out and let provinces run schools and let parents raise kids.
These arguments aren't new, especially when it comes to policies and curriculum around gender identity and sexual orientation in school. But the people making them have become louder at a time when the concept of parental rights is a top issue in the U.S. for Republicans. Back in March, a parental rights bill was passed in the Republican-held House, and more than 24 state houses have passed similar legislation. Today, I'm talking to the Washington Post's Emma Brown about the origins of the parental rights movement in the U.S., how it became a massive political force there, and how that might help us understand the implications of similar rhetoric here in Canada. Hi, Emma. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I wanted to start with the term parental rights. On the surface, it sounds unobjectionable because parents would have their children's best interests at heart. But tell me about how this term has been used recently.
Yeah, the parental rights movement is definitely a distinctive movement that has a political valence to it. It is a conservative movement here in the United States that has come to represent parents who are concerned about what's being taught in schools and are seeking, in many instances, to limit what can be taught about sexuality and gender and race and history.
Yeah. And can you give me some notable examples of where parental rights has been used to push legislation and shape policy in the U.S.?
I am a former education reporter, and issues around children and education are always sort of, I feel, when I covered education, sort of on the sidelines. And more recently, parental rights movement has moved to the center of politics, particularly in Republican politics. And we see that especially in Virginia, where Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, really won the governor's seat back from Democrats on a platform of parental rights.
Because it's time to get back to normal. It's time to empower parents. And I am so excited that Virginia is leading in a bipartisan way to give parents the power to choose whether their child wears a mask or not in school.
And in Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis has turned it into the center, not only of his governorship, but of his argument that he should be president.
I think the idea that somehow your own kids, when they go to the school system, that parents have no role in what's going on there is absurd. Of course, parents have a fundamental role in the education of their kids, in the upbringing of their kids, and that's just the way it's got to be.
Right. So this has also come up in Canada, in New Brunswick, and in Saskatchewan with a couple of policies that I mentioned in the intro. Now we've heard Ontario Premier Doug Ford also weigh in, saying that parents should be informed if their child wants to use a different pronoun.
It's not up to the teachers. It's not up to the school boards to indoctrinate our kids. It's the parents' responsibility to hear what the kids are doing and not the school board.
I feel like it's worth noting parental rights never seem to involve parents who want more inclusive policies and who do want their kids to learn about race and identity. Like you said, it's used more in socially conservative circles, and there are people who think that it's a dog whistle about LGBTQ plus people, for example. And I'm wondering, what kind of pushback have we seen around this from the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, first I'll say that the legislation that has been passing here in our state governments, and some of our state governments, sounds similar to the push that's happening in Canada. So in Florida, DeSantis and the Republican-dominated legislature there have passed laws, to limit what can be taught about sexuality and gender.
This morning, the Florida law critics dub the Don't Say Gay bill is expanding.
Gender ideology has no place in our K-12 school system.
Florida's Board of Education agreed to ban classroom instruction about sexual orientation and gender identity in all grades except for health class.
And there are a number of legal efforts underway to push back against policies in schools that allow children to transition genders at school, sometimes without their parents' knowledge or consent. So the same issues, it sounds like, are at play here as in Canada. And it's become such a central political issue. And so we see it happening on a political front, that there's pushback against these efforts. But I think there's also just sort of a quieter effort among parents of LGBT students and parents who are concerned about LGBT students to figure out how to handle this new landscape.
What kind of harm do these parents and advocates for LGBTQ plus students say that these kinds of policies have on kids?
What I hear from parents of LGBT students and advocates for those students is that these policies being passed in the name of parental rights, that they are in opposition to children's rights and to the health and mental health of children.
I've seen situations where kids aren't able to tell their parents, and it increases chances of self-harm and suicide. Kids that are trans are 10 times more likely to commit suicide.
So there's a lot of outrage, I think, among those folks as to the way that this is being framed as a parental rights issue, because they say, which parents? It's only some parents that this movement represents.
Yeah, and some of the issues where the idea of parental rights is being invoked are issues where kids would want protection from their parents, right? Like in cases, for example, where kids don't feel safe coming out as gay or trans to their families.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the argument that I hear from parents who are concerned about these measures, that children in some families need to have the space at school and the trusted adults at school to come out to talk about everything that's going on inside them that they don't feel safe talking with their parents about. And so there's sort of this tension between, I think, children's rights in the eyes of many and parents' rights. This movement, the parental rights movement, has sort of burst into the mainstream recently, but it has been simmering for a long time at the fringes of the Republican Party here. And this tension between, parental rights and children's rights is longstanding and goes back decades.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the history of this movement in a bit, but first, like you mentioned, it's really exploded politically recently in the US, and that hasn't really happened at the same scale or been as organized an effort in Canada. We've mostly seen parents kind of sporadically organize on issues of gender identity and sexuality. Like, for example, there were these protests here in Ontario in 2015 over revamping the sex ed curriculum.
Is to teach this radical program, and I don't believe any person has the right to enforce their own idea of sexuality on the entire school board. 2 million children. It's wrong.
Your parental rights don't come from Kathleen Wynne. Your parental rights come from God.
Similar types of protests have happened elsewhere in the country, but it hasn't been a full-fledged movement. So why do you think the parental rights movement has gained so much traction in the US in the last few years?
Well, when I talk to people who are on all sides of this issue, they pretty much all agree that the pandemic played a really key role in kind of galvanizing and then accelerating the growth of this movement. There was much to be upset about during the pandemic, for sure, including, parents were upset about school closures, about the way online school was being conducted. Then there was, when kids were back to school, lots of debate, of course, about mask mandates and so on. And I think there was an energy among parents that was galvanized and a political engagement that happened there that people, as I said, on all sides of this issue sort of agree got this ball rolling in a big way in the United States.
Yeah. And then we saw politicians like Ron DeSantis and Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin kind of seize on the discontent of parents who had been watching over kids while schools were closed, right?
Absolutely. I mean, at first, there was sort of a wave of executive orders and legislation in states like Virginia under Youngkin and Florida under DeSantis around banning mask mandates. And then that sort of moved into the realm of so-called critical race theory and opposing critical race theory, which, is sort of a way of talking about how we teach about race and history and Black history and slavery in the United States. And then more recently, we've seen it with, it sort of morphed more into legislation and policies around gender and how schools handle transgender students, gender transition, and how schools handle sex ed.
Okay, so that's what we've seen in recent years. But like you said, this movement actually has a long and pretty fascinating history in the US that you wrote about. So can you tell me about its origins?
Yes. So the parental rights movement has become this incredibly powerful force in recent years, but it has been, as I said before, sort of simmering for many years on the fringes, and it goes back really to the 1980s, to the movement among Christian homeschoolers to legalize homeschooling around the country. And the leader of that movement is a conservative lawyer named Michael Ferris.
I'm here to speak to you about I think the ultimate form of privatization of education, that is homeschooling. but I'm also here in support of the basic concepts of privatization because I believe
he is best known for his efforts to, and they were successful efforts to legalize homeschooling around the country with the argument that, parents should have the right to educate their children as they see fit.
Now, homeschool freedom means basically this. All freedom is actually pretty simple. Freedom means the ability to you make the decision rather than government make the decision. Where should your kids go to school? Who makes the decision? A free parent decides, I'll make the decision where my child goes to school.
So that's what he's best known for. But really, he's also had a longstanding interest in how public schools operate.
And he started fighting for the rights of homeschoolers around the same time that there was a lot of panic in the US around communism and the moral direction of the country. And around this time, former US President Ronald Reagan was also talking about parents' rights and making these big changes to the public education system that were about giving local school systems more power and giving parents more of a choice about where to send their kids to school.
But better education doesn't mean a bigger Department of Education. In fact, that department should be abolished. Instead, we must do a better job teaching the basics, insisting on discipline and results, encouraging competition, and above all, remembering that education does not begin with Washington officials or even state and local officials. It begins in the home.
Well, Ferris really comes out of that. I mean, he cut his teeth in that time period. He was a lawyer for the Moral Majority, which is a socially conservative and religiously affiliated group. He represents a wing of American politics, which is sort of grounded in an evangelical Christianity, is pushing back against, for example, gay marriage. I mean, Ferris argued against the authority of the federal government to decriminalize gay sex. He has a long history of really socially conservative positions.
What we've been about in the conservative movement, in the pro-family, pro-life, pro-Bible movement for the last 20 years or so, is we've been about putting our fingers in the dike. In particular, there's so many problems in education because while we try our best to get leaders who have the right values, we keep training up the next generation in the wrong values on a systematic basis.
Mike Ferris is not a household name in the United States. He's not really widely known outside of conservative circles. But he has had this enormous impact, and you can hear it in the rhetoric that's being used today by Ron DeSantis and Glenn Youngkin, and even former President Donald Trump as he campaigns again. When they talk about parental rights and when they talk about what they see as the problems in public schools, they are using talking points that Mike Ferris has been using for decades.
So religion has historically been part of this movement in the US, and it still is to this day. In Canada, we've seen a bit of that. We've seen in recent months, for example, in Alberta and Ontario, some Muslim parents take their kids out of school to protest elements of the school curriculum around gender identity and sexual orientation, as well as pride celebrations. In the past, we've seen some fundamentalist Christian groups protest gender-inclusive policies, and they say that it's about religious freedom and that these events and these policies are not aligned with their faith. What role does religion play in the parental rights movement today in the U.S.?
It plays a really important role. I mean, Ferris and people like him have been arguing for a long time that schools are trying to foist a secularism upon students and shouldn't be allowed to do that.
By 3/4 of the teenagers believe in situational ethics. Only 9% believe that morality is absolute, and the rest are mixed up. It is an alarming fact that can only be credited to the fact of where our kids getting in their education and their values from the media. We must be alarmed at these factors.
And that argument has never really caught hold in our courts. But I think that with the conservative Supreme Court that we have now and a judiciary that's really influenced by the number of conservative judges who were appointed by former President Trump, there are sort of a renewed set of challenges to argue that schools are too secular and are sort of enforcing a secular worldview in a way that violates parents' rights to determine, their family's faith. And that that argument is made a lot around how schools talk about gender and how schools talk about race.
Right. But there are a lot of people who say that this movement, it's not about religion, it's about something else entirely, and that's undermining the public education system. So, can you talk about the kind of impact that the parental rights movement is having on that front in the US?
Yeah, I think that one remarkable thing that I learned in my reporting is how what began as an effort to, ensure the rights of parents to opt out of the public school system has really um, now showing itself to be a movement that is about influencing the public school system itself, and in a couple of ways. One way is through, limiting or shaping what can be taught about gender and sexuality and race in schools, and what books can be in libraries and all of that. And another is what you just said. It's how our public dollars are used. There have long been efforts to expand vouchers in the US to allow people to essentially take the public money that would go to their public schools if their child went to the public schools and use it for private schools. And that effort has just been supercharged in the last few years, coinciding with the rise of the parental rights movement. So we see now in a number of conservative states these new programs that are not just sort of voucher programs to allow students, and often impoverished students, to escape poor public schools, which is what vouchers have traditionally been in the United States, but to allow all students everywhere to opt out of public schools and take their money with them, not only to private schools, but for homeschooling. So that it's a sort of unleashing of public money into families' pocketbooks and into private schools. And this is happening in a way that advocates for public school fear is really undermining public schools by draining them of the resources they need.
So, Emma, in the US, these conversations around parental rights, they've been going on for a while, and in Canada, they're growing. I'm wondering, what do you think Canadians should keep an eye out for as that conversation evolves here?
Well, I think there's two things. One is there's a lot, I learned a lot about our current parental rights movement by looking at the history and coming to understand where it came from. So I found that really instructive to understanding the United States movement better. And then the second thing is thinking about which parents are included, as we talked about earlier, in the parental rights movement and which are not. So I spoke, for example, to the mother of a transgender student who in Virginia, following a policy that Governor Youngkin put forth that would change how schools handle transgender students in a way that this mother found pretty offensive. And she said to me, look, which parents are really served by this and which students are really served by this? She said, not me and not my, not my child. And this is a parent who has actually really politically connected. She's a school board member in one of Virginia's largest school districts. She is running for the state legislature. And she said even she feels, despite those political connections, as if parents like her do not have an organized and unified voice to kind of provide an alternate point of view to the parents who are organized under the, quote unquote, parental rights movement.
Okay, Emma, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's all for today. I'm Tamara Kendacker. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Hi, I'm Tamara Kendacker. For more than 30 years now, an odd ritual has taken place in the Nevada desert. the burning of a larger-than-life wooden effigy called the Man. But this year's festivities were a little different.
Power is out everywhere.
A very soggy Burning Man. We're kind of screwed here.
Well, I'm soaking wet, and everything on the inside of my tent is soaking wet.
Rain began pouring down last Friday, turning the desert dust into a thick sludge.
Reporting live from Burning Man. I just used the porta potty. Conditions in this post-rain are not ideal. The alkaline dust has turned into clay.
Well, I'm here at Burning Man 2023, where the rain has turned the playa into a giant mud pit.
Some people made it out, walking to the nearest passable road.
Woo! A road, you guys. I've never been so excited in my life to see a road. Exodus!
You may have seen the video of Diplo and Chris Rock. They hitched a ride on a fan's truck after hiking for 3 hours in the mud.
If I can get a cold brew right now.
But thousands of others who came to party were essentially trapped. Their cars stuck in the mud, told by organizers to shelter in place and conserve food, water, and fuel.
Here's the proof of life update. I am alive, but all the activities are shut down. We all slept all night with no house music bumping. Everything stopped because of that. So they shut the water down. I'm walking around helping pull power cables out of the ground so they don't get stuck in the mud, and all we're doing is...
All kinds of misinformation started swirling around on social media about the conditions campers were dealing with.
There is no Ebola outbreak, and there's no fence being built. You guys are ridiculous, like seriously.
And we can say for sure there was no Ebola outbreak, but one person did die. Authorities now say they suspect an overdose. By Monday, the grounds began to dry and harden. People were free to go. And it seems like those who'd stayed through the worst of it had a pretty good time, like Mark Fromson, a Canadian guy we talked to when he was still there earlier this week. He told us the rave didn't stop.
Believe it or not, the burners kept burning. There was music all night. People were partying. There was lots of bonfires. There were people walking around. Lots of people said it's the best burn they've ever had, even with the rain. I did see a bunch of people mud wrestling and doing slip and slide. I saw one girl just kind of lying out on her back in a huge puddle, just kind of floating there and looking up at the sky, which was pretty cool.
Mark is a Burning Man true believer. He's been 5 times now. But others are much more skeptical. And as the rain poured down on the party, a lot of the reaction from people watching the chaos from the outside was derision, even schadenfreude. To understand why, you first need to get a sense of what this festival is all about and what it's become over the years. So today, I'm talking to Keith Spencer. He's a journalist in California's Bay Area who's written about and been to Burning Man. Hi, Keith. Thank you for doing this.
Hi, great to be here.
It's great to have you. So we've given people a bit of a sense of what Burning Man looked like this year with the rain and the mud, but can you just step back and give us a sense of what Burning Man actually is?
Sure, yeah. So basically, it's in the middle of the Black Rock Desert in Nevada, maybe 2 hours north by northeast of Reno. Almost nothing lives there. It's sort of just an empty, deserty playa. And every year it gets transformed for about almost 2 weeks into a city with, the titular man at the center. And tens of thousands of people come to the festival. It's very freeform. I mean, it's very anarchic. I would say the short answer is that it's a big anarchic party in the desert with lots of pyrotechnics, art, drugs, and nudity. And it's guided by a couple principles. The most famous ones include radical inclusion, radical self-expression, and radical self-reliance. So that's the utopian answer to that question. Mm-hmm. The cheeky answer is that it's become a networking event for Silicon Valley techies because it kind of fits with their worldview of themselves. Like, I think a lot of them think that both their startups and this festival are both these radical things that are going to change the world somehow.
Yeah. We'll get into that more in a bit, but I've seen a lot of photos from previous years, and it does look pretty beautiful. All these giant sculptures and lights in the desert, and that land is actually owned by the federal government, right? The Bureau of Land Management. So how does that impact the vibe of the festival?
Correct. So partly because it's owned by BLM, it has to remain this blank canvas. So you have to pack in everything and pack out everything. You can't leave no trace. That's one of the sort of guiding principles of the festival. So people aren't supposed to leave anything behind. But I think also because it's a blank canvas and mostly lifeless, you can do a lot of things you couldn't do if you rented BLM land, say in like a forest or in Chaparral or something, because you can have a lot of pyrotechnics and you can have weird, what are called art cars, which are not street legal vehicles that, parade around the festival, often blaring house music or something, like party cars. Some of them are sort of the size of boats. They're like boats on wheels. Or I rode in one at Burning Man once that was like kind of like a mech warrior. Like it didn't have wheels, it had legs, and it sort of walked around. It was kind of cool.
Wow. I know at one point it was this kind of free, low-key event with weird art, started in San Francisco on a beach, but over the years it's become this huge phenomenon, right? Attendance has been swelling in recent years. And how big and how pricey has Burning Man become at this point?
Yeah, so to get a guaranteed ticket, like they had sort of a pre-sale this year, and the tickets it was something around $1,500. And that was to guarantee a spot. And then the regular ticket, I believe, was $575, plus you had to pay, I think it was like $150 or $160 to park if you wanted to bring your car in. And then, keep in mind that this was, when it started, it was free. And then in the mid 90s, it was like $35. And the last time I went, which was a while ago in 2009, it was like around $300 or something like that. So it's way outpaced inflation in terms of the cost. And then up until this year, the resale market was just really expensive for the tickets. Like, people would pay $2,000-$3,000 for a resale ticket.
Wow. The number that I've seen floating around has been like 70,000 people. But I understand that there have been signs that its popularity is waning, right?
Yeah, so 70,000 sounds big, right? But usually it's 80,000. So it wasn't full this year.
Mm-hmm.
And I find this really, really interesting just in terms of its history, is that it seems like we've sort of hit the peak in terms of interest. Like I think last year it sold out like usual, but this year it didn't. Estimates I've seen right now are like 73,000 people went there. And then also really fascinatingly, this year, it was very easy to get a resale ticket, and they were selling for hundreds of dollars below face value.
Wow.
Like you could get a ticket for $100. Something's shifted in the air there.
Yeah, I want to get into that, like why we might have reached peak Burning Man. And before we get into who shows up to the festival, let's talk about the conditions of the event itself. I imagine this is the first Burning Man that the president had to be briefed on, but it's not unusual for there to be like extreme and uncomfortable weather conditions, right?
No, yeah. So I think that's sort of part of the, quote unquote fun of it. I mean, some people would find this fun, some wouldn't, but there's a certain challenge in surviving there, and it's a desert, and it's very exposed. So in the daytime it's super hot, and at nighttime it can get pretty cold. As a result of climate change, there's more super hot days in deserts all over the world. Like I grew up in the desert. I grew up in the Sonoran Desert in Tucson, which isn't super far from Nevada, and I see this happening with my family home. Like, the number of 90 plus, 100 plus days is just going up and up. And the same thing's happening in Nevada, in the Black Rock Desert. So there's more hot days now, which is like, okay, that on one hand, burners are probably relatively prepared for. But the other thing is that it's become super popular. And the best way to go in is with a car, like with an RV or with your an SUV packed with all your stuff on the roof or in a trailer. And the line to get in, as you can imagine, because there's no, real infrastructure, can take 6 hours. I did it in the middle of the night the last time I went there, and it took 6 hours for us to get through. And my friends who went last year and this year told me that in 2022, it took 9 hours.
Oh my gosh.
So like, imagine this, like, it's not like there's a gas station once you get inside. So you can't run the AC, at least not for all 9 hours. You're in the hot sun, you're baking, you can't really move. You're sitting in traffic, you got to turn the car on and off. And last year they said it was just absolutely miserable. And a lot of people were complaining about that last year, like just sitting for 9 hours in the heat to get in and out. And you can't really use your AC.
That sounds awful. I also read that because of climate change, there are more dust storms, and
Yes.
the dust is alkaline, so it kind of burns, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So like when I went there last, I had a little spray bottle with like a little bit of vinegar in it, I believe, or was it baking soda? I'm blanking exactly, but basically you need something to combat the alkalinity. But yeah, it's the dust storms can be super uncomfortable. I mean, besides getting dirt in your eye, which sucks, it's a mild irritant on the skin.
Yeah. Okay, so this all sounds like a bit of an ordeal, which I guess is part of the fun of it, but like the weather does sound kind of uncomfortable. But let's talk about who goes to Burning Man. I think for a long time I pictured kind of a hippie-ish vibe, but who else is known for showing up to Burning Man?
Yeah, that's definitely what it was, particularly in the early days. And then it really kind of became a tech networking event. There are deals inked there, and historically there have been venture capitalists who go to try to discover talent and new companies to invest in, and make handshake deals and such. So it's been called Silicon Valley's most important networking event, and a huge constituency of the people going are people who live in the Bay Area and work in Silicon Valley in some capacity, and a lot of them probably are just programmers and stuff. But there's also a lot of tech CEOs like to go. Like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk have all been known to go in the past, as well as one of the Google founders, Larry Page.
So Elon Musk, he said in the past that Burning Man is Silicon Valley. And what do you think he meant by that? Or if it's too hard to get in his head, why do you think these two worlds, Burning Man and Silicon Valley, have become so intertwined?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that Silicon Valley exists where it does exist, right, is because some of the counterculture ideals, back in the 60s, the hippie era, kind of bled into Silicon Valley. Like there was a certain utopianism about technology that inspired a lot of the early tech workers, and also with experimentation. Like, famously, Steve Jobs was kind of hippie, and he talked openly about taking acid and stuff like that. And so with regards to the formation of Silicon Valley, it was very much rooted in the counterculture. And obviously, the sort of Bay Area hippie counterculture movement also was one of the progenitors of Burning Man, right? So they have that connection. But I really think the more salient answer is that they have cultural similarities, right? Like they both Silicon Valley and Burning Man kind of see themselves in the same way. Like a lot of Silicon Valley techies, even nowadays, like a lot, when the rest of the world is very cynical about the tech industry, a lot of people who work in Silicon Valley who are founders or high up tech CEOs, they really believe what they're making is going to somehow radically change the world. And then likewise, I think, Burning Man, it really has this, it bills itself as something radical is happening here, like that we're changing minds or changing the world or something like that, which, I don't believe personally. I mean, I think it's fun or whatever, but I don't think there's anything really radical about it, to be honest.
Yeah, it sounds almost like a libertarian oasis.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right. I mean, it's sort of the way that it looks is kind of mediated by the wealthy people who go there, right? Like they have the most power and influence and ability to shape it, I would say.
So how does this immense wealth coexist then with a lot of the Burning Man ethos and principles, like you talked about, the radical self-reliance, the communal effort, decommodification? How do those two things coexist?
I think decreasingly so. I mean, so there's a census there, just like there is in the real world in a real nation state or something like that. And the proportion of people who make over $100,000 a year in personal income has gone way up. Like I looked back into the statistics, and in 2015, 24% of attendees made more than $100,000 annual personal income, and then in 2022 it was 41.2%. So that's a pretty big jump. And there was also more than double proportion of attendees who made more than 300K in that time. Wow. So it's becoming more of a festival and a place for wealthy people to go and maybe feel like their conscience is a little different or something like that. If it keeps getting to be more and more wealthy, and the price of it, obviously, if the price of it continues being super high, and rich people certainly have more of an ability to shape it, there's not going to be nearly as many artists and nearly as much good art and nearly as many sort of hippies or traveler types.
But these really wealthy, comfortable people, I imagine they're not doing the hard work of setting up the campsites and living communally with others in the way that Burning Man is ideally supposed to be.
Yeah, there's been a lot of infighting over this within the burner community and within the Burning Man organization itself. Like they're called derogatorily turnkey camps because it's like other people set them up and you can just come in. And yeah, if you go and look at Burning Man's website, they've talked about how they've tried to push back against this.
Yeah. So you mentioned the leave no trace principle. Everyone's supposed to clean up after themselves, but there have been complaints. At least one local sheriff is complaining that people end up leaving huge amounts of trash in Reno, Nevada, and this year, because of the mud, a lot of stuff has been left behind, right? Cars, tents, carpets, even entire campsites.
Yeah, right. Now people were fleeing this year because of the weather and it was miserable and difficult affair to get out. One of the most arresting images I've seen is of the bicycles left behind each year. A lot of people fly into Reno, right? You can't fly with a bicycle, so you buy a bike at the Walmart there, and then you go out to Burning Man, and then when you're done with your bike, you just discard it in Reno somewhere. And there are these images you can look up of like thousands of these bikes that were just used for one weekend and they're just like thrown out.
Right. Not to mention the broader environmental impact. Like I know there were climate change protesters that actually showed up this year with a bunch of demands. They were demanding that the festival ban private jets, single-use plastics, unnecessary propane burning, all kinds of things, right? Because building a temporary city every year for 70 to 80,000 people is bad for the environment.
Totally. Yeah. And that is one thing I probably mention to your listeners is that there is an airport that temporarily exists there. It's a dirt runway, so it's not like, you can't land a 747 there, but a lot of super wealthy people will fly in and out that way and not have to come in the 9-hour line with the riffraff.
So you wrote a piece about the gentrification of Burning Man many years ago, so this isn't a new phenomenon at all. And the contempt that we saw from people when it got rained on this year has been building for a really long time. But you still have friends who go, right? And what did they tell you about how it's changed in their view?
Yeah, I know. I have a lot of friends who go, and the ones who were trying to get me to go this year, like, I was talking to my friend Sean, and he was like, yeah, like I agree with everything you've like written about Burning Man not being radical anymore, but the one thing you forgot to account for is like it's a really good place to take drugs.
Yeah.
So he went, and he was also telling me, he and a couple other mutual friends of ours who have a camp every year, they're the ones who were saying like, the art was really bad last year, and the conditions were really miserable last year, and that seems like it might partly be why this year was like, the resale tickets were so cheap and it didn't get to capacity. And then on top of that, this disaster with the weather happened. So they ended up fleeing in the middle of the night, and like they had a 4x4 car and they drove like, out past the trash fence and just got out.
Oh man, they got lucky.
Going through the mud. Yeah, and in like a Jeep.
Yeah. So Keith, why do you think it matters that this desert hippie art festival has gotten gentrified?
I think that like Burning Man is very interesting as a cultural phenomenon, and it's very like it's connected to Bay Area and Silicon Valley culture in a lot of ways, right? And understanding it is kind of key to understanding Silicon Valley and the California ideology and the Silicon Valley mindset. And I think the other obvious reason it matters, right, is the environmental reason, the environmental impact. It's like generating a huge amount of waste and CO2 to wet end, I guess. I guess the one more thing I might add, which I think is probably its future, is that there is this thing in the Bay Area that's called the Bohemian Grove. So this goes back in the late 19th century, or early 20th century, some artists and musicians founded this artist colony and club and escape, right? Mm-hmm. And they ended up bringing in a bunch of businessmen, and then the businessmen sort of took over. And nowadays, the Bohemian Grove is like one of the most kind of elite clubs for wealthy conservatives in the United States. Like the Bush family is in it, and Karl Rove famously talked about the Iraq War. Then, it has the word Bohemian in its name, but it's like it's far from it, right? It's like a super elite private club. And so I kind of think the future of Burning Man is this. Like, I think it's going to become like the Bohemian Grove, where in its name, it sounds like it's a artsy or, working class endeavor, but it's sort of just like a private club for rich people to party and have fun.
Yeah, I can totally see the parallels. Okay, Keith, thank you so much for giving us a window into this really fascinating world. I appreciate it. This was super fun.
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much for talking to me.
All right, that's all for now. This week, Front Burner was produced by Imogen Burchard, Shannon Higgins, Lauren Donnelly, and Derek Vanderwyk. Our sound design was by Matt Cameron and Sam McNulty. Our music is by Joseph Shabison. Our senior producer is Elaine Chow. Our executive producer is Nick McCabe-Locos. And I'm Tamara Kandaker. Thank you so much for listening. Front Burner will be back on Monday. Hi, I'm Tamara Kandaker. So for almost a year now, Doug Ford has tried to brush away criticisms of his Greenbelt plan. But the controversy's not going away. And this week, he was back at it.
You know, we realize it. We admit our mistakes. I've come out here, we've apologized, we're moving forward. But nothing is more important than building homes.
This is all about his plan to open up land that's had environmental protections for years to developers who now stand to make an estimated $8.3 billion. A lot has happened since we last covered the story, when the province's Auditor General released a report declaring that Ontario's plans to build on previously protected farmlands, forests, and wetlands were heavily influenced by a small group of well-connected developers.
That, to me, smells of corruption, and I think we need to call it that.
It's an issue of ethics, of principles, of morality, which have all been blatantly and clearly breached.
In the past few weeks, there have been 2 high-profile political resignations, revelations about a mysterious consultant known as Mr. X, and another provincial watchdog report that slammed the Greenbelt land swap as rushed and flawed. And then on Tuesday, the premier announced his government is going to reevaluate the land swap sites as part of a sweeping review of all Greenbelt lands and development applications. All of this has left us with a ton of questions. So today I'm joined by Emma McIntosh. She's an environment reporter at the Narwhal, and she's been closely following the story. Hey, Emma, welcome back. Thanks for doing this.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So let's get into this. We have a lot to dig into. Let's start with the resignation of Ryan Amato, who was the chief of staff for the housing minister, Steve Clark. He was identified by the Auditor General report as if not the person who kind of spearheaded this whole process of choosing land to be removed from the Greenbelt. And in late August, after the report came out, he resigned. But since then, another report has come out from the Ontario Integrity Commissioner. And what did we learn that's new about Ryan Amato from that report?
The Integrity Commissioner pretty much backed up a lot of what the Auditor General said, which is that Ryan Amato was the ringleader of this whole chaotic, reckless process that led to land being taken out of the Greenbelt. But for the first time, we're really hearing Ryan Amato's side of the story and also what he was telling other people while this was going on. One of the most interesting things in it was that Ryan Amato told public servants that he was acting on orders directly from the premier. But the Integrity Commissioner found that that actually wasn't true, that he could find no proof that the premier had told Ryan Amato to do any of this. There are all these contrasting pieces of evidence and interviews that really paint a confusing picture. For one thing, Amato talks about this one meeting he had with the premier where he walked out knowing that he had to do this. The premier says this never happened. It's all super confusing and super muddled.
Yeah. And so what does Ryan Amato himself say about the way that he's made out to look in this report, or the allegations against him in the report?
Ryan Amato hasn't given any media interviews yet, but in a piece of his resignation letter that leaked to media, he contested it. He said that he feels a proper and fair investigation would clear him of wrongdoing. Now, it's difficult, right? Because 2 separate independent watchdogs have found that he was the ringleader of this whole thing. But, it's worth noting that he has lawyered up.
And let's dig into this report a little bit more. Aside from the stuff about Ryan Amato, what else did you find interesting in it that you think we should note?
Oh my gosh, there's so much. This whole thing was really like a movie. For the first time, we also have substantial testimony from the developers who were involved in all of this. There's talk of the developer rumor mill, which Ryan Amato is quoted as saying is like high school gossip networks, where people seemed to know about the Greenbelt changes in advance, and the rumors were really spreading like wildfire in the community. There are tales of allegedly illegal lobbying and special lobbying bonuses, which are not allowed. And then there's also the tale of this mysterious figure named Mr. X.
Yeah, and we'll talk about him in a second, but what did the report say about Doug Ford and his role in this whole controversy?
The report really illuminated what Doug Ford knew and when he knew it. So I've reported that the Premier's office appeared to be having some discussions about the Greenbelt in late June 2022, after the election. But the Integrity Commissioner actually revealed that had been happening a lot sooner, during the election, before voting was over. But Ford staff did not tell the public. His campaign didn't tell the public. And so voters didn't have the chance to weigh in on that idea. The other thing is, we know for sure that Premier Ford was the one who gave the order to open the Greenbelt. There is some disagreement because the Integrity Commissioner found that Ryan Amato misunderstood what he was being asked to do, and that actually they didn't want him to open up the Greenbelt super fast and do all the things he did. But ultimately, Premier Ford did give the order for them to explore this idea of opening up the Greenbelt.
Right.
And of course, like I mentioned earlier, there are all these questions about what exactly he told Ryan Amato to do. At one point, Ryan Amato said that he had received 3 packages of information about properties from the Premier. But when the Integrity Commissioner asked him about this, he denied that had happened, and Premier Ford denied that it had happened. And so really, the whole thing raises more questions than it answers.
And so, just to be clear, what has Premier Ford's response to questions about his role in the controversy been?
Since day one, the Premier has really maintained that he had no idea what the ministry was doing, what Ryan Amato was doing, and what Steve Clark was doing when it came to the Greenbelt.
There's one thing, folks, that I don't believe in: micromanaging. Even in my private company, when I had it, I don't believe in micromanaging managers. I don't believe in micromanaging ministers. I have confidence in our ministers and to follow the process.
He said, I'm not a micromanager. I'm not going to be controlling my staff like that. But some of his other statements have been kind of contradictory. On the one hand, the Premier says he doesn't give 2 hoots about the developers.
I don't give 2 hoots about these developers, but they're part of the system. The builders build. What do you want me to do?
But on the other hand, he's said that they're his personal friends. Still, he's maintaining that, although he didn't know what was going on, he accepts that the process was flawed. But that in turn raises more questions, right? If it was so flawed, why not undo it and start over?
So then on Monday, we saw another resignation that we should talk about, that of Ontario's Municipal Affairs and Housing Minister, Steve Clark. And this came as a bit of a surprise, right? Why was this unexpected?
I think that this was so crazy because Ford and Clark had maintained that he wouldn't resign for so long. All of this started 3 weeks ago now. And since the very first report came out, they have maintained Steve Clark is remaining on as minister. No doubt about it. And even before the long weekend, Steve Clark gave a news conference where he was insisting the very same thing, 4 days before he resigned. He stood up there and took questions and repeated over and over again that he would be staying.
I completely accept the responsibility that I was overly reliant on my chief and my staff. But I accept.
Why don't you resign today, Minister?
I'm here to accept responsibility, Richard, for the lack of.
That being said, the whole thing was starting to feel like the beginning of the end, I think, by the end of Thursday. There was a solemnness, a somberness about Minister Clark, who at times almost appeared a little emotional, like maybe he was realizing in real time that it was over.
And it sounds, based on his response, that he thought he would be able to stay on. Like he said in the announcement, this is a quote, "Although my initial thought was that I could stay in this role and establish a proper process so that these mistakes don't happen, I realize that my presence will only cause a further distraction from the important work that needs to be done and that I need to take accountability for what has transpired." He wrote this on Twitter. And I'm wondering, what do you make of this resignation? What kind of larger questions does it bring up for you?
Oh man, there are so many. For one thing, I really wonder if this is going to make a dent in the public backlash. The Integrity Commissioner's report really showed that Steve Clark didn't want to do this. He was unhappy with what the premier was asking him to do. And that was why he stayed out of it, which was ultimately what led to him being found to have violated ethics rules because he wasn't keeping a close enough eye on his staff. And so it really raises like a zillion questions. Like, did the premier set up Steve Clark to fail? Because as everybody in this Integrity Commissioner report seems to know, this idea was not going to be politically popular, especially when Steve Clark had just spent 4 years telling Ontario that he wouldn't touch the Greenbelt. It raises questions about why Clark didn't push back, why he chose to bury his head in the sand.
Mm-hmm.
And it also really raises questions about what Ford is going to do now that Clark, who was kind of serving as his shield, is gone. One phrase the premier has thrown around a lot is that the buck stops with me. And yeah, it kind of seems like the buck has gotten there now because there's no one else left to take the harsh questions.
You mentioned another character that's popped up in all of this who was identified in the Ontario Integrity Commissioner's report only as Mr. X. And over the weekend, he was identified by media as former Clarington Mayor John Mutton. And he's in the report, he's this mysterious development consultant. Tell me a bit about him and what role he allegedly played in all of this.
Okay, well, here's the part of the story where we really veer into the realm of the absurd. From the beginning, this whole thing has kind of felt more like a Hollywood script than an Ontario government scandal, to be honest.
Yeah.
But this really just cranks it up to 100. So John Mutton is a bodybuilder / magic mushrooms entrepreneur / development guy. He works at this firm that seems primarily aimed at facilitating development. He denies that he's a lobbyist, but we'll find out the answer to that question eventually. It's important to know that John Mutton denies that he is Mr. X as identified in the report.
Right.
The Integrity Commissioner cannot name Mr. X right now because he's not allowed to say whether or not an investigation is being conducted into a specific lobbyist until it's done. But when the commissioner is done looking at this case, we'll probably find out more. What's being alleged right now is that Mr. X had a contract with a development company that would have seen him get $1 million if a property in Clarington, a community outside of Toronto, was successfully removed from the Greenbelt. And if that sounds weird, it's because it is. A lobbying success fee is illegal in Ontario. And there are all these other wild details about this guy. His nickname is the Muttonator. Some of his colleagues also have interesting names. And there's even a post on social media where he hashtagged it MZOs are us. And an MZO is a special zoning order thing that you can get from the government. So it's just the details of this are getting weirder and weirder, basically.
Yeah, some of the allegations against him are that he tried to take government staffers out for golf, lunch, a Raptors game, right?
Yeah, and so we know the lunch happened. I believe it was at the Joey's at the Eaton Center. But the staffers involved deny that they ever went to the Raptors game or went golfing with him. Mm-hmm. I expect that we'll find out the answers to those uncertainties whenever the Integrity Commissioner finishes his work on this.
All right, so that brings us to the Premier's latest announcement. On Tuesday, one day after Minister Clark's resignation, Doug Ford said that his government is going to be reevaluating the Greenbelt as part of a larger mandated review.
We're going to make sure that we consult with everyone. We're following the recommendations of the Auditor General, and we'll continue to follow the recommendations. But there's going to be a complete review from top to bottom, and then they're going to have to stand on their own merit.
And it was kind of confusing because at first it seemed like the government would be rethinking the controversial decision to develop on the Greenbelt land in question, but that's not really what's happening, right?
No, it kind of looks like it's maybe the opposite. So basically, what's going on is the government is looking at the entire Greenbelt. And specifically, they're looking at 700 or 800 applications that the government has already received from developers to open up their lands. And really, like, I can hear myself saying a lot, like, we'll see, we'll find out. But that's really what's going on here. So many things are up in the air. We have like the vague outlines of a timeline, but there's also every indication that the government is using this as an opportunity to see whether there are any other Greenbelt lands that could be open for development. And so that's, I think, the really important thing here is, yeah, some of the remaining portions of land that the government removed from the Greenbelt last year might end up going back in, but they're also now looking at hundreds of other things that could come out.
And in the meantime, he and the new housing minister, Paul Calandra, have said development is going to continue on those 14 sites that have been removed already as this review's ongoing.
The review will include the 14 parcels of land that were removed from the Greenbelts. We will include that in our review. But at the same time, I have spoken to the provincial facilitator yesterday, lands facilitator yesterday. I reiterated my commitment to ensuring that we get shovels in the ground, but also to ensuring...
Yeah, and that's another confusing thing, right? If it's under review, usually things are paused while that happens. But in this case, the Premier is, if anything, telling them to go faster, reiterating threats that if he doesn't see significant progress on that land by the end of this year and shovels in the ground by 2025, he'll return it to the Greenbelt.
And just a message to the 14 owners of this property. If I don't see movement, you're going back into the Greenbelt. This isn't about the builders. I don't give two hoots about the builders.
And that's like lightning fast in development timelines, right? And so it's kind of this dual message. Like, hold on, we're doing a review. Maybe this stuff won't actually go through, but also do it as fast as you can.
Yeah. And so far, Doug Ford seems to be doubling down on this line that the land is needed for housing, right? That was disputed by the Auditor General's report. It said there's no evidence this land is needed for housing. And we've already talked at length in previous episodes about why this land is widely seen as a very bad choice for housing development. Yet he's clinging on to this talking point.
And as sure as I'm standing here, folks, there's going to be people that are going to be able to afford a home, an attainable home. There's going to be more rentals than there's ever been.
So can you lay out for me the argument people are making that this isn't about housing at all?
Yeah, I think there's a few big pieces of information that people have honed in on. So number one, the government wasn't even looking at development feasibility when they were picking these pieces of land. We can actually see in the Integrity Commissioner's report a detailed timeline of how this went down. And they didn't even start talking about like how many houses could be built there until the final days before this was being made public. So that's one thing. It really wasn't a consideration. And I think like you've talked about on the show before, it could take up to 25 years for some of these pieces of land to be developable. Number two, we already have more than enough land. This has been identified in a ton of different reports from a ton of different sources, including a provincial government panel. Now, the Premier has fought back against that, and he said, well, we commissioned that report from that panel before we got revised immigration targets that mean more people will be moving here. And I want to address that because I think it's an important point. Yes, that was before they received that target, but the Ontario government has asked for more people to move here. And it also started the process of opening the Greenbelt lands before it received that new target. And the last thing is that task force that I talked about, it came up with dozens of recommendations for how the government could actually alleviate the housing crisis. And so I think a lot of people are asking, like, if this is about housing, why not do that? Or why not reinstate full rent control? Why go for this land that, sources seem to agree wasn't even necessary anyway?
So now we're almost a year into this controversy. It's only gotten worse and worse. Yet the only thing that we've seen is a mini cabinet shuffle and 2 resignations. And I'm wondering, what has been the political impact for Doug Ford as a result of all of this?
Well, it's good timing for you to ask because we're just starting to see the very first polls that show how this is affecting his support. And sure enough, it looks like the premier's support is starting to slide. I've been listening to a lot of CBC radio lately, and I've been hearing a lot of call-in shows where people talk about their disappointment, where they express anger.
Well, I think that Ford is the one that needs to resign. He needs to take responsibility.
I'm a longtime supporter of the provincial PCs, and as I've informed the party, when Mr. Ford is no longer premier, I will renew my membership.
But if this goes through and he doesn't pay attention and reverse course, I'll never vote Conservative again.
I think back in November, when this was just a story about developers buying land that got unlocked from the Greenbelt, people might have had feelings about it, but it isn't the way it is now. Now we have all these details, right, of secret packages passed from person to person and $1 million Greenbelt fees and Mr. X. And now people have resigned, and we know there are more reports coming from various watchdogs. And these are things that are very easy for anyone to understand, right? And so I think it's starting to impact the premier quite a bit, and that does not seem to be a problem that is going away anytime soon.
Right. And then before I let you go, Emma, for people who are wondering what happens next, the RCMP is currently weighing whether there are grounds for potential police investigation into the land swaps. And the last time we talked about the story, we kind of left on this idea that for people who are interested in stopping this development, the only real hope that they have is leveraging the power of public outrage or for municipalities to make things really hard on that level. And is that still where we're at?
Yeah, definitely. While all of this scandal and gossip and drama is playing out at Queen's Park and in the halls of power, really, what will determine the fate of this land is mostly playing out in the municipalities where the land is. These are the local councils who are tasked with either, granting the permits to make this development happen or for denying them. And so I think that's really the best place for people to make themselves heard, whether you like it, whether you don't like it, or you think it should be done another way. I think that's where this is going next.
Okay, Emma, thank you so much for doing this. I know it's not an easy story to unpack because there's so many different characters and so many different layers, but I appreciate it.
Always fun to talk through the Greenbelt cinematic universe.
All right, before I let you go, some news broke after we recorded this conversation. In response to the provincial watchdog reports we've been talking about today, Ontario's Attorney General has announced it will review the provincial legislation that governs lobbyists in an effort to address significant concerns around lobbying practices in the province. Now, that's all for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Thank you for listening to Front Burner.